Have you ever stood behind a curtain, your palms slick with nervous excitement, listening to the low hum of a crowd waiting for you? My name is Charlotte Avery, and on a summer night in June, I stood backstage at my very first book launch, watching the soft glow of the lights spill across the shelves of Mayberry books. In that moment, I thought about all the nights I'd sat hunched over my battered laptop coffee, growing cold beside unpaid bills, words blurring as my hope faded in and out like a weak radio signal. I had poured 6 years, 6 stubborn, aching, ordinary years into the pages that now lined the front window. All I wanted truly was to look into that sea of strangers and see a few familiar faces smiling back at me. I thought it would make everything real. Behind the curtain, I caught sight of my best friend Madison flashing me an encouraging grin. She'd always believed I could do this, even when I doubted myself, especially then. The bookstore was alive with a gentle chaos, old professors, fellow writers, local readers who'd followed my blog since it was just midnight rambles and dog-eared dreams. But somewhere under the pulse of my heartbeat, I kept searching for my family, the ones who'd heard me mutter story ideas through bathroom doors and cry over rejections at the kitchen sink. Tonight, 3 chairs sat empty in the front row, reserved with little cards that said Mom, Dad, and Tyler. I told myself they were running late, stuck in traffic, or maybe just nervous for me too. Isn't it strange how hope has a way of clinging on, even when reason has already packed its bags? When the host called my name, I took a deep breath and stepped into the light. For a heartbeat, it felt like floating, like all those years of smallness and silence had been worth it, just to stand here seen. I spoke about growing up in the sleepy town of Riversedge, about falling in love with stories because they made me feel less alone. I saw people nod, laugh, some even brush away a tear. Madison was right there in the front, her hands clasped, eyes bright with pride. But all the while I kept glancing at those empty seats, feeling their absence like a second, sharper kind of spotlight. After the applause, after the photos and the friendly handshakes, I stood by the window watching the last guests wander out into the night. The city sparkled, my heart ached. I was surrounded, but still a little bit alone. Back in my apartment that night, the navy dress still crisp with the memory of strangers' admiration, I didn't cry, not right away. I replayed the laughter, the clapping, the kindness of people who had only known me as words on a page. I tried to tell myself it was enough. Maybe it should have been. I took a picture of the stage, the 3 empty chairs in the front row, catching the glow of the closing lights. I posted it to my little circle online, captioning it, "Sometimes the people who matter most are the ones who actually show up." It wasn't bitter, just honest. Then I closed my eyes and listened to the quiet, wishing for something I couldn't quite name. That was the night I realized success doesn't always fill the spaces you hoped it would. Sometimes it simply shines a light on what's missing, and sometimes that's where the real story begins. The next morning, sunlight crept through my kitchen blinds, and I reached for my phone before I even remembered the ache in my chest. There it was, a new notification, a photo from my brother Tyler's social feed. He was grinning at a backyard barbecue, one arm round Dad, the other balancing a plate stacked high with ribs. Mom was there too, laughing, drink in hand. The caption read, "Nothing beats family time. Wouldn't trade these moments for the world." In the comments, old friends chimed in. "You guys are our family goals. Your parents are the best." Nobody knew what the 3 of them had skipped last night. It was as if my launch had been just another Thursday, not the night their daughter's lifelong dream finally stepped into the light. I stared at the image for a long while, my thumb frozen above the heart-shaped like button. Was it petty to feel hurt? Maybe. But feelings have a way of telling us the truth we don't want to say out loud. All those empty seats weren't just an accident. They were a pattern woven through birthdays spent waiting for a phone call, graduation ceremonies with only Madison cheering from the stands, holidays where my presence was the afterthought. Tyler, my older brother, had always been the golden child, the one whose college dropouts were shrugged off as finding himself, whose every new girlfriend got a place at the table, whose little mishaps were dismissed with fond laughter. "He needs us," Mom would say. "You're the strong one, Charlotte. You'll be fine." But sometimes I wondered how strong you had to be before anyone saw you at all. It's not a uniquely mine story. Over the years, I've read about it in novels, watched it flicker across characters in movies, and heard it in the voices of people who approached me after readings. There's even a term for it, golden child and scapegoat roles that families knowingly or not assign. In so many American homes, one child becomes the sun around which everything orbits. The other, quiet, steady, responsible, learns to be grateful for crumbs of attention. Sometimes we tell ourselves we don't need anyone. But the truth is, we all want to be seen. We want to matter. And when that recognition doesn't come from the people who raised us, the ache it leaves behind is like an old bruise faded but never gone. Growing up, I used to think maybe I was too sensitive. I remember the year Tyler got a family cruise for his birthday while I unwrapped a department store gift card. It's practical, honey, and you love books to a shop that didn't even carry my size. I remember coming home after my first college acceptance letter, only to find the kitchen filled with balloons for Tyler's latest job interview. I told myself it was okay. I told myself my victories were my own, and that was enough. But every now and then, usually in moments like last night, I'd feel that old pang. What's wrong with me that the people I love most can't be bothered to show up? It's so easy, especially in American culture, to believe that family first means family is always right. Social media is filled with those glossy holiday photos and viral posts about unconditional love. But for so many of us, the picture is incomplete. Sometimes family can be the source of our deepest wounds, and sometimes those wounds stay hidden because we're too ashamed or too loyal to speak them out loud. I've learned this truth from readers, women and men who line up after events to whisper that part about the empty chairs. That's my life too. Their stories echo mine in 100 quiet ways. A mother who missed every recital because her son needed extra help at school. A father who called his daughter's promotion a fluke. A grandmother whose baking was overlooked for her brother's baseball trophies. These stories don't make the pain smaller, but they remind us we're not as alone as we think. Madison came by that afternoon with coffee and gentle words. She didn't tell me to get over it or to be the bigger person. She simply said, "Your story matters even when the people you wrote it for can't see it." Sometimes all it takes is one person to recognize your hurt for you to start healing. In her quiet way, Madison helped me see that my longing to be seen wasn't weakness, it was human. That afternoon, I allowed myself to grieve for what was missing. I wrote in my journal not about anger or revenge, but about truth. The truth that you can love people and still feel invisible to them. The truth that success is sweeter when you have someone to share it with, but it's still yours, even if you don't. Looking back now, I realize the biggest mistake wasn't feeling the ache, it was believing that my worth depended on the ones who couldn't see me. I started to understand that sometimes the lesson isn't to try harder for love, but to love yourself enough to stop trying so hard. That shift doesn't happen overnight, but it's a first step, a gentle, shaky step towards something better. And as the afternoon faded into evening, I found myself looking forward ever so slightly to what might come next. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for empty seats to fill and start filling my own life with people with purpose, with the stories only I could write. That was the day a new kind of hope began to stir. Not the desperate hope that someone else would change, but the quiet hope that I could. And in the warm kitchen light, with Madison's laughter echoing through my small apartment, I started to believe it just might be enough. In the days that followed, my phone never stopped buzzing, but not with the messages I hoped for. There were comments and tags on Tyler's barbecue post, relatives sharing it with captions like, "What a beautiful family," and coworkers chiming in. "You're so lucky, Charlotte, to have such loving parents." I wanted to respond to tell them what really happened. Instead, I scrolled quietly, feeling the familiar ache. The world was seeing the curated highlight reel, not the messy truth behind it. My family was there smiling for the camera while the story of my life, my book, my hard-won night, was nowhere to be found in their smiles. Sometimes I wondered if they even remembered. It's strange, isn't it? The harder you work for something, the more you want the people you love to notice. But there I was, a published author, and the only place my book existed in my family's world was as a footnote, if that. Tyler posted a photo of himself holding my novel a week later, captioning it, "So proud of my sister. Family wins are the best wins." The comments poured in, a real brother. "You must be so proud," and I let them be. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't point out he hadn't even attended the launch or opened the book. I realized that sometimes the story people tell about you matters more to them than the real you ever could. I heard from a distant cousin Anna who'd followed my writing journey for years. She sent a simple message. "I saw your book on the shelf at Prairie Books." I teared up. "You made it, Char." That meant more than she knew. For a moment, I was transported back to summers at my grandmother's house where Anna and I would pretend to host our own radio shows or write stories in spiral notebooks. I wondered how often real support comes from those you least expect, and how sometimes the people you thought would cheer you on are the ones least able to show up. There's a kind of grief in that, but also a strange relief because it means you can stop waiting for validation where it's never coming. So many people, especially in America, grew up with that classic family portrait on the wall, everyone smiling in matching sweaters or pressed shirts as if all troubles melted away in front of the camera. But just outside the frame, life is rarely so neat. I started noticing it everywhere, friends who talked about their parents' Instagram-perfect holidays, but confessed over coffee that the house had never felt lonelier. Colleagues who dodged questions about Thanksgiving dinners because their families couldn't be in the same room together. The gap between appearance and reality is wide, and it can feel like a canyon when you're standing on the lonely side of it. What surprised me most was how quickly people rushed to defend the perfect family image. If I mentioned feeling left out, the answers came fast. I'm sure they meant well. "You're just sensitive. At least you have a family." I used to believe those words, brushing away my own pain, as if it were a childish complaint. But I learned through my own experience and the stories readers shared that it's okay to name what hurts. Just because a wound isn't visible in photos doesn't mean it isn't real. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that what looks like love isn't always loving. If there's one lesson I wish I'd learned sooner, it's this: success won't always buy you the recognition you crave from those closest to you. It can fill rooms with applause-lined shelves with trophies, even earn nods from strangers. But if the people you love aren't ready or willing to celebrate with you, that's their journey, not your failure. There is strength in refusing to shrink yourself to fit someone else's version of happiness. There is dignity in letting your story be enough, even if it goes unmentioned in the family album. One evening, Madison found me staring at an old photograph, me and Tyler knee-deep in a pile of autumn leaves, laughter caught mid-air. "They love you in their own way," she said gently, "but it might never look like what you need." That truth hurt, but it also set something free inside me. I was tired of holding my breath for approval, tired of making myself small. If I couldn't change my family's story, maybe I could start rewriting my own. It was around this time that Madison began to remind me quietly but insistently that not all families are made the same way. Maybe it's time to look at the people who always show up for you. She said one night, her voice soft as dusk, "Sometimes you get to choose your family." Her words stayed with me, echoing through my days like a promise of something better. And in that gentle encouragement, I started to sense the first glimmer of courage to draw new boundaries, to seek joy outside of old patterns, and to let myself believe that being seen, truly seen, was possible after all. Madison always had a way of showing up right when I needed her most. The afternoon after that wave of family photos and the ache that lingered, she appeared at my door with 2 coffees, a warm bag of croissants, and that determined look that said she wouldn't leave until I let her in emotionally, not just through the door. We sat on my old thrift store couch, our knees tucked beneath us, the late sunlight painting gold across the living room wall. It felt safe, the way it always did when Madison was near. There's a kind of family you build not through blood, but through years of standing by each other when nobody else does. She listened as I poured out every frustration, every moment I'd felt unseen and small. She didn't rush to fix it. Madison just nodded, her hands curled around her coffee, and let me spill over. When I finally finished, she smiled gently. "You know," she said, "sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone witness your hurt." "I'm here for all of it, Char." Her words filled the empty space that my family had left behind. In that simple moment, I realized how rare and precious it was to have a friend who understood not just the headlines of your life, but all the messy footnotes too. It's easy to overlook the quiet strength of friendship when you're busy chasing after the love and approval of family. Growing up, the idea of family first had been hammered into my mind, as if blood was the only glue that could hold a heart together. But as I watched Madison fuss over my bookshelf, recommending my own novel to her friends online, it hit me that chosen family often steps in where the old bonds fall short. In so many ways, Madison had already been that family. She was the one who sat with me through my worst panic attacks in college, holding my hand and whispering jokes until the world felt safe again. She was there for every heartbreak, every silly celebration, every ugly cry. Her loyalty reminded me of the countless stories I'd heard from others, people who'd survived tough childhoods, divorce, loss, or disappointment, but who found solace in the friends they gathered along the way. One of my favorite authors, Maya Angelou, once wrote about how friends are the family you get to choose. In book signings and after readings, strangers sometimes approach to say, "Your story reminded me of my best friend. I don't know where I'd be without her." Their gratitude was never loud, but it was always deep, like an old tree's roots holding steady in a storm. There's power in recognizing who really stands with you when the world seems to crumble. In American culture, where self-sufficiency is praised and independence celebrated, it's easy to forget how much we need each other until we're left alone with our pain. But over coffee, or during long walks in the park, or in the laughter that comes after an awful day, you realize being seen doesn't always have to come from where you first hoped. Sometimes it arrives softly dressed in a friend's concern, or a late-night text, a plate of warm cookies, or a silent, reassuring hug. The mistake I used to make was ignoring the people who showed up, because I was so focused on those who didn't. I'd wait by the phone for a call from my mother when Madison was already knocking on my door. I'd scroll through photos of happy families, missing the happiness that was right beside me. The small, everyday kindnesses Madison offered were in their own way far more honest than any forced smile or holiday card. Friendship, I learned, is not just a supplement for family, it's sometimes the main course. That evening, as the city lights blinked on outside my window, Madison and I made a pact to celebrate every small win together, no matter how tiny. She pulled out a notebook and started listing all the things we could toast, finishing a chapter, getting through a rough day, making the perfect cup of coffee. It sounded silly, but as we laughed, I felt something in me start to mend. Love, I realized, isn't just something you're given. Sometimes it's something you make over and over with the people who keep showing up. As we finished our croissants and planned our next victory party, I looked at Madison and felt a quiet gratitude settle in my chest. Maybe I couldn't rewrite my family's past, but I could start investing more in the relationships that made me feel whole. Maybe it was time to build some boundaries, not as walls to keep people out, but as fences to protect the garden I was learning to grow with the ones who truly cared. And as night fell and Madison waved goodbye, I found myself ready at last to begin that work. After that evening with Madison, I felt a shift inside me, a quiet resolve, not hard or angry, but steady and sure. Instead of pouring my energy into endless texts and calls to my parents, and Tyler hoping they would finally notice I decided to do something new, I chose silence. I didn't make any grand announcement or angry speech. I simply stopped reaching out first. I watched how empty the days felt at first, like pulling back from a habit you're not sure you're ready to break. But gradually, I found comfort in the quiet. It was a boundary soft but real that let me breathe without constantly bracing for disappointment. Silence, I learned, isn't always about shutting people out. It's about giving yourself room to heal. In the beginning, my absence barely registered. There were still family group chats about Tyler's new car or Mom's garden, still social posts about Sunday brunches I hadn't been invited to. Sometimes it hurt to see their lives move on without me. But with every message I left unanswered, and every event I quietly declined, I felt a small piece of myself return. There is a kind of power in stepping back and choosing not to participate in the rituals that keep you feeling small. My world shrank for a little while, but then, almost unexpectedly, it started to expand in better ways. Setting boundaries is celebrated in self-help books and Instagram quotes, but in real life, especially for women and daughters, it's much harder than it looks. In American culture, we're taught to be the fixers, the peacekeepers, the ones who put family first at any cost. I used to believe that if I just tried harder, if I was more patient, more forgiving, more present, eventually I would be loved in the way I needed. But love isn't something you can bargain for or earn with good behavior. Sometimes stepping away is the most loving thing you can do for yourself. I had to remind myself again and again that saying no isn't rejection, it's self-preservation. I started filling my days with things that nourished me rather than trying to fill the silence with busy work or forced positivity. I walked through the city, taking photos of sunlit sidewalks and bustling cafes. I joined a writing group at the local library, where nobody knew my last name or cared about my family history. I let Madison drag me to trivia nights and open mic events, letting laughter soak into all the places that had been tight with worry. It wasn't about pretending my family didn't matter, it was about letting myself matter too. Real-life stories from friends and even strangers showed me I wasn't alone. One woman in my writing group, Lydia, told me about the year she stopped talking to her father after a painful argument. At first, the silence felt suffocating. But then, she said it was like clearing weeds from a garden. I could finally see what else could grow. Another friend, Marcus, shared how stepping back from toxic family patterns gave him space to build healthier relationships elsewhere. Their courage helped me feel less selfish, less afraid of being misunderstood. The mistake I used to make was believing that silence meant failure, that if my phone didn't buzz with a message from Mom, I'd somehow lost the game of love. But what I found was the opposite. The more I respected my boundaries, the more I trusted myself. The small wins started adding up: a peaceful morning, an honest conversation with Madison, a moment of joy, reading feedback from a stranger who loved my book. It was a quiet happiness, not loud or showy, but steady as sunlight through a kitchen window. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's that you don't have to keep shouting to be heard or keep chasing what hurts you. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is space, the kind that lets you hear your own voice again. As the weeks turned to months, I felt less and less like I was waiting for my family to change. Instead, I found myself changing, growing into a version of myself who no longer apologized for her own needs. That growing confidence became the soil for something new, something bold and unexpected. And it was in this newfound quiet that I discovered the power not just to step back, but to rewrite my own story on my own terms. The next chapter, I realized, wouldn't be about getting even. It would be about taking back the narrative entirely. Not every act of reclaiming your life is loud. Sometimes it's as quiet as a signature on a contract or a simple, purposeful choice. In the months that followed my shift to silence, something new and slightly mischievous began to take root inside me, a sense of agency, a desire to direct my own story rather than let it be told for me. For years, I'd believed that justice or closure meant some big confrontation, an apology, or a reckoning. But what I discovered was far more subtle and in its own way poetic. It started with a call from my publisher. My novel, despite the muted celebration at home, had become a quiet sensation, earning editor's pick honors in several indie bookstores. There was talk of an adaptation, and my confidence slowly, quietly began to grow. One of the bookstores that carried my book was Willow and Ink, a charming literary cafe chain I'd always loved, and coincidentally, the place my family frequented for Sunday brunches and birthday gatherings. What my family didn't know was that thanks to a successful freelance project and a well-timed investment, I was now a silent partner in Willow and Ink. When the founder decided to retire, the chance to buy a controlling share landed in my lap. I took it, not out of spite, but out of possibility. As owner, I didn't change the name or fire anyone. I simply updated the guest policy. Certain weekends were now reserved for private events, and standing reservations like the one Tyler always boasted about would need to be confirmed. The first Sunday this went into effect, I wasn't even there. But Madison texted me a stream of laughing emojis and screenshots, Tyler, my parents, and a few of their friends all standing awkwardly outside the cafe, turned away by a gentle, smiling hostess who politely explained, "Sorry you're not on today's guest list." The irony was almost cinematic. The place where they'd celebrated so many of Tyler's milestones was now for one day a room they couldn't enter. Word got around quickly, first a ripple, then a quiet wave. Friends who knew the full story sent me messages, some in awe, some just grateful for the poetic justice. I didn't gloat, but I allowed myself a private smile. There's something healing about quietly shifting the balance, about knowing you can change the rules even if no one else ever learns the whole truth. It wasn't vengeance. It was a gentle rewriting of the narrative, proof that I didn't need to make a scene to make a point. In American culture, revenge is often depicted as grand and fiery confrontations, courtroom showdowns, dramatic exposés. But most real-life vindication happens in quieter ways. Sometimes it's in the form of a successful career built despite doubters, or the quiet happiness of finding your own circle of support. I heard from other writers, some famous, some just starting out, who had similar stories, parents who missed launches, friends who didn't show up, critics who later became fans. Their triumphs weren't about proving others wrong, but about proving themselves right in their own time, on their own terms. The lesson in all of this is that taking back your story doesn't always mean shouting or demanding to be heard. Sometimes it means moving forward so decisively that those who doubted you can only watch from the sidelines. It's not about hurting them, it's about finally beautifully prioritizing your own peace. That day, as I sipped coffee with Madison and scrolled through the cafe's tagged photos, I realized my narrative belonged to me. I could be both generous and discerning. I could decide who had a seat at my table. This subtle, powerful shift was just the beginning. For the first time, I felt the freedom to decide how and with whom I wanted to share my life's big moments. The guest list, both literal and metaphorical, was mine to write. As I mailed out signed copies of my novel to distant relatives, friends, and mentors, skipping the people who had never really shown up, I felt lighter. My story was no longer about chasing old approval. It was about honoring the support that had always been there and leaving space for new connections to blossom. With this newfound strength, I started preparing for something I'd once thought impossible: a public reading at the biggest regional literary conference in the state. I had a message, a voice, and a platform. But this time, the audience I wanted to reach wasn't just those who'd never listened. It was everyone who'd ever sat in an empty chair waiting for their moment to come. And as I took my first steps toward the stage, I knew I was finally fully ready to tell the truth loudly or softly, but always on my own terms. In the quiet aftermath of that poetic turn, I found myself thinking not about retribution, but about recognition. There's something deeply human in wanting to be acknowledged by the people who shaped us, even if that acknowledgement comes from elsewhere. So I took a different kind of action. I ordered a box of my newly printed books, and over several evenings sat at my little kitchen table and wrote out personal notes of gratitude. I sent copies to aunts and uncles who had mailed birthday cards when I was in college, to old teachers who'd scribbled "Don't give up" in the margins of my earliest stories, to friends I'd drifted from, but who once cheered for me. Each letter was a small act of remembrance, an affirmation that while some seats might stay empty, others were quietly filled by kindness. It surprised me how many wrote back. Cousin Anna, now living in Seattle, messaged, "Your book sits on my nightstand. I'm so proud of you." My old high school English teacher replied with a photo of my book on his classroom shelf and a note saying, "Your voice matters to the next generation." Their responses, though sometimes brief, stitched together a new tapestry of support. It made me realize how easy it is to overlook the people who do show up, even in subtle ways. For every family myth of the golden child, of perfect unity, of unconditional presence, there were real everyday gestures of care that had quietly sustained me all along. Meanwhile, my parents and Tyler finally received a letter too, but it wasn't from me. The invitation to my upcoming conference reading came directly from the event organizers, formal and impersonal. I knew they would see my name on the program and recognize the occasion, But for once, I didn't feel compelled to soften the distance or make excuses for their absence. If they came, it would be on their terms, not mine. I no longer needed to script a narrative that made them heroes in a story they barely appeared in. That realization was unexpectedly liberating. I started to see similar stories everywhere. After one of my book events, a woman named Patricia approached me and shared her own family secret. My brother's the star in every photo, but it's my sisters and I who keep each other afloat. She laughed gently, as if letting go of a weight she'd carried for years. At another reading, a young man named Drew confessed that he hadn't spoken to his father in 5 years, and yet he'd found a patchwork family among friends and co-workers who celebrated his smallest victories. Their stories echoed my own, like a quiet chorus. You are not alone. Family is bigger than you think. Sometimes American culture tries to convince us that blood is thicker than water, that family myths must be preserved at all costs, even when they hurt. But the truth is far more nuanced. So many people carry the silent ache of not quite fitting the family mold, of being the afterthought, the fixer, or the peacekeeper. We're taught to swallow our stories to keep the myth alive. But I learned that speaking the truth, even if only in letters never sent, is a step toward healing. It allows us to reclaim our own narrative, to celebrate the mosaic of real relationships that have shaped us. The lesson for me was gentle but profound. Sometimes support comes from places you never expected, and sometimes letting go of old myths is the bravest thing you can do. I didn't need my family to rewrite the past or apologize for every empty seat. I just needed to honor the people who had shown up, and to accept that my story, like so many others, was full of unexpected twists and unexpected love. That acceptance was what carried me into the next chapter, stepping into the spotlight at the conference, not as someone chasing approval, but as a woman ready to speak the truth with all the quiet strength she had gathered along the way. The night of the regional conference arrived with all the anticipation of a graduation, a wedding, and a leap of faith combined. The hall was packed with writers and readers, their conversations blending into a warm, hopeful hum. I waited backstage, the script for my talk tucked in my hand, the words, "The Power of Naming Pain," scrawled across the title page. I thought about all the people who had shared their own invisible wounds with me over the years, each story a reminder that silence may protect us from conflict, but it also keeps us from healing. Tonight I wanted to step into the light, not as someone seeking pity, but as someone willing to tell the truth for myself, and for those who'd never had the chance. When my name was called, I took a breath and stepped onto the stage. From the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of my parents and Tyler sitting near the back, stiff and unsmiling, unsure if they belonged. I didn't let myself dwell on it. Instead, I looked for Madison, who gave me a small, steady thumbs up. The spotlight was bright, but it felt gentle somehow, like it was there to warm, not expose. I began to speak, sharing stories of empty chairs and unanswered calls, of the ache that comes from wanting to be seen by those closest to us, and the courage it takes to name that ache aloud. I explained how for so long I thought ignoring my pain would make it disappear. I gave examples from my own life birthdays where my parents' absence was masked by elaborate excuses, book milestones turned into afterthoughts. I talked about the cultural myth that being strong means swallowing your hurt and never letting anyone see you bleed. But real strength, I realized, is in facing what hurts, giving it a name, letting it breathe, and trusting that someone somewhere will understand. I told the story of a reader who'd approached me after assigning eyes shining with recognition. I thought I was the only one, she whispered. But she wasn't, and neither was I. The room was silent in that electric way when everyone is listening, really listening. I saw tears in a few eyes, nods from strangers, and even a softening in my mother's expression. I shared a quote I loved from the poet Naira Waheed. "The thing you are most afraid to write. Write that. Naming our pain." I said doesn't make us weak. It makes us honest. And honesty is where healing begins. I offered a gentle challenge to everyone in the audience, holding on to invisible stories. It was okay to speak them, or to write them, or to simply let themselves feel them, even if no one else ever understood. After the talk, there was a line of people waiting to thank me, some with quiet handshakes, others with long, heartfelt hugs. A man named Eli confided that he hadn't talked to his brother in years, but maybe now he would try. A woman, her voice trembling, said she would finally tell her daughter why she'd always avoided family holidays. It struck me then that pain is universal, but so is the hope for connection and understanding. The act of naming it aloud in public in a room full of witnesses created a kind of magic. It made us all a little less alone. The lesson I carried home that night was simple: silence can keep you safe, but it can also keep you isolated. Naming your hurt, even if it shakes the ground beneath you, is a radical act of self-love. It is the start of something new, a life where you honor your story no matter who else is listening. As I left the stage, I felt lighter, unburdened, and oddly grateful for every empty chair, every unanswered call, every ache that had brought me here. I knew the journey wasn't over. Forgiveness for myself and for others would be the next mountain to climb, but I finally believed I was strong enough to try. After the conference, something in my heart shifted, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but quietly, like a wound that finally begins to knit itself beneath the surface. The following week, an envelope appeared in my mailbox, addressed in my mother's careful handwriting. Inside was a letter, not a text or an email, but actual paper, as if she'd known this needed to be different. She wrote about missing the launch, about not understanding how much it meant, about the way she'd always loved me, even if it hadn't always looked like love. She said she wasn't asking for forgiveness, only hoping I'd find the peace she hadn't known how to give. Reading her words, I felt a tangle of relief, sadness, and something like compassion for both of us. It's a strange thing, forgiveness. For years I'd imagined it would arrive with a grand gesture, tears, apologies, maybe a family dinner where everything was finally said. But instead, it came slowly, more as a decision than a feeling. I realized that forgiveness wasn't really about letting someone off the hook or pretending the pain never happened. It was about letting go of the grip that old hurt had on me, allowing myself to move forward without dragging the weight of disappointment everywhere I went. In American culture, we talk a lot about moving on, but the truth is, healing isn't linear or clean. Sometimes you forgive in small doses again and again, even if the other person never fully understands. Real-life stories of healing echoed this lesson. Lydia from my writing group once shared that after years of estrangement from her sister, she'd stopped waiting for the perfect apology. Instead, she forgave for her own sake. It's not forgetting, she said, it's just refusing to give that old wound any more of my today. Another friend, Marcus, talked about forgiving his father even though their relationship would never be close. The forgiveness, he said, was for his own heart, so he could build something better with the family he'd chosen. Their honesty reminded me that healing is personal, unique for everyone, and not dependent on anyone else's timeline or permission. I learned bit by bit that letting go didn't mean pretending I wasn't hurt, or that my needs didn't matter. It meant acknowledging the pain, naming it, and then choosing every day not to let it define me. I could love my family flaws and all, and still protect the boundaries I'd worked so hard to build. I could remember the empty chairs, but I didn't have to sit in that sadness forever. There was power in this, a quiet kind of freedom that allowed new joy to take root. The small lesson, gentle but clear, was that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. You do it to reclaim your story, to make room for the life you want. Sometimes forgiveness is a letter folded and tucked away in a drawer, a conversation never had a silent wish for both of you to heal in your own ways. You don't have to wait for the other person to change, or even to understand. Healing is yours to claim. In the evenings, I found myself reaching for hope not out of desperation, but out of genuine curiosity for what life could be with less bitterness. Madison and I planned another small celebration, not for any milestone in particular, but just because it felt good to gather the people who loved me exactly as I was. We laughed, we cooked, we told stories, old and new. In that warmth, I realized I was surrounded by a different kind of family, the one I'd built for myself. As the season turned and another book deadline approached, I felt lighter, less tangled up in the ache of what might have been. Forgiveness wasn't a finish line, but it was the start of something new, a life lived on my own terms, with love that felt chosen and true. And as I looked ahead to my next book launch, I knew the story would go on wider, braver, and infinitely more my own. The next book launch came not with anxiety, but with a kind of peaceful anticipation. This time I chose a sunlit event space downtown. The walls hung with photos from my journey, snapshots of old typewritten drafts, laughter-filled writing groups, and celebrations with Madison and my chosen family. 3 chairs stood empty in the front row, each marked not with names, but with words, respect, support, and presence. As guests arrived, those chairs became a gentle symbol, a quiet reminder of what really mattered. I didn't feel the ache of absence anymore. I felt the fullness of what I'd built, one connection, one small act of courage at a time. Looking back, every moment along this winding path mattered. The nights I stood in front of empty seats aching for family approval, the sting of being overlooked, the heavy silence I finally learned to cherish. There were lessons in every ache, every late-night conversation with Madison, every small celebration that kept my hope alive. I learned that being overlooked doesn't mean you're unworthy, and that your story is enough no matter who shows up to witness it. In American families and all over the world, so many of us long for recognition from those we love. But sometimes the people who finally see you are the ones you find along the way. I realized that setting boundaries was not an act of rebellion, but of self-respect. The power of silence is not in shutting people out, but in giving yourself room to heal and grow. I learned to celebrate poetic justice not by hurting anyone, but by rewriting my own narrative, choosing who had a seat at my table and letting go of myths that never fit. Support can come from unexpected places, a distant cousin, an old friend, a reader whose life you'll never fully know. Every letter never sent, every story bravely named became a step toward healing. Forgiveness, I discovered, isn't a grand public act or a performance for anyone else. It's a private, ongoing choice to let old pain rest so you can move forward with your heart lighter. I built a new family from the people who showed up, and in doing so, discovered that family can be so much bigger than blood. There's beauty in choosing love over longing and creating your own belonging instead of waiting for it. As I closed the event, I looked around the room at Madison, at Lydia from my writing group, at faces old and new, all gathered because they believed in the power of stories and the courage it takes to tell them. I thanked everyone for being part of this journey, for listening, for sharing, for reminding me that none of us is truly alone when we find the courage to speak our truth. If my story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever longed for the applause of people who just couldn't show up, or if you're still learning to forgive and belong, I hope you'll stay with me, like, comment, and subscribe to join this growing circle of support. Share your own stories, celebrate your own victories, and remember, the most important seat at the table is the one you fill for yourself. We're all writing new chapters every day. Let's keep telling them together.